Her clan threw her away as Barren. 3 weeks later, the rancher chose her over a kingdom. Leave me, human. I'm worth nothing now. The words came out cracked and low, from the figure slumped against the broken fence at the edge of Peter's grazing land. Rain hammered the mud around her. She was enormous, even folded over like that. Grey-green shoulders broader than any man's, one leg twisted wrong beneath her, blood thinning to pink in the puddles. She had been walking for days. Her bare feet were split raw. Peter dropped his water pails and knelt without thinking, pressing his weathered hands to the gash along her thigh. He never noticed the fine, torn silk beneath her mud-caked furs, or the heavy iron ring braided into her hair. He only saw someone freezing and pulled off his coat. He had no idea he had just knelt before an exiled orc chieftain's daughter. Before we go on, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight and subscribe to OrcBond's Saga, where two impossible lives keep finding a home in each other. Now the story. The land sat where the valley grass gave out and the pine wood began. And the folk in the village 3 miles down the road liked to say a man had to be either stubborn or broken to work ground that poor. Peter Marsh was probably both. He was 32, learning the way men get when the labor never stops and the meals stay small. His dark hair had gone grey too early at the temples, and his forearms carried a decade of rope burn and thorn. He ran a small herd, a dozen heads of cattle grown thin over a hard winter, a handful of goats that ate anything and respected nothing, and one old grey horse named for a colour it no longer wore. Behind the cottage stood a barn he had raised with his own hands, leaning a little but sound, and a corral fenced with rough rail and a strand of low wire along the back. The cottage itself was a single room, with a stone hearth, and one cracked window he had filled with wax against the cold. Everything about the place spoke of poverty. Everything about the way it was kept spoke of a man who refused to let poverty win. The floor was swept. The few plates stood washed and stacked on the shelf. Herbs hung in neat bundles from the rafter over the fire, and behind a hand-woven fence a small patch of winter greens still held on. This was the home of someone who had lost nearly everything and would not let the little that remained fall into ruin. Now he had a wounded giant on that land, and the light was failing, and the rain would not stop. Getting her inside was less a matter of carrying than of slow, staggering negotiation across the mud, her arm heavy across his shoulders, her breath hot and ragged against the side of his face. She smelled of wet fur and old leather and blood. When he lowered her onto the straw mattress, the whole frame groaned under her weight, and for a moment they both went still, listening to hear whether it would hold. It was held. He worked the way he did everything, without hurry and without waste. He built the fire up and set water to heat. He cut a clean shirt into strips because he had no proper bandages. He crushed dried yarrow into a paste the way his mother had taught him a lifetime ago, and something in the motion of it, the grinding of the herb under his thumb, opened a door in him that he kept shut. Behind it was a small, hot room, a child's fever, his own hands doing this exact work and not being enough. He pushed the door closed. Then he turned to the orc's leg with the cloth. She caught his wrist. Her grip could have snapped it like kindling. In a low, formal voice, she asked him why a human would put his hands on an orc without a blade in the other one. He told her plainly that he was trying to keep her from bleeding to death on his floor. He said that if she wanted to break his arm, she was welcome to do it after the stitching, because he had one candle left, and he would rather not waste it arguing. Something shifted behind her yellow eyes. She let him work. She watched him the whole time, the way a hawk watches a field, and he felt her stare on the back of his neck. She was younger than her scars first suggested, in her late 20s perhaps, but even flat on her back, she held herself like someone accustomed to a room going quiet when she entered it. Her speech was strange, clipped and courtly, carrying an accent from somewhere far past the mountains. When he offered her water, she drank it as though testing it for poison, then drained the rest in a single long pull. After a pause, she thanked him in a way that plainly cost her something. She gave no name at first. Then grudging, she said she was called Yorena. He suspected it was half a name at best and did not press. A man who has learned that questions drive people off learns to hold his tongue. He banked the fire and spread his own thin blanket on the cold stone by the hearth, so the stranger in his bed could keep the warmth. Before he lay down, he went out one last time into the rain to look at the corral, and finding the low wire sagging along the back rail, he pegged it tight, muttering to himself in the wet. When he came back in dripping, he told her to mind that back fence if she ever walked out. The wire ran low and mean at the knee, he said, and it had put down animals a good deal bigger than her. She did not answer. She had already slipped halfway into fever. He slept badly. Near the black middle of the night he woke to her voice, not speaking to him, speaking to no one, thick and slurred, her huge hand fisting in the blanket. She said a name he did not know, Thanos. She said it again, and then she said, "Tell my father," and then nothing else that made any sense. He wet a cloth and cooled her brow until she quieted. He filed the name away without understanding it, the way he filed everything, and let it go. He did not know he had just heard the name of the man who had thrown her away. Far off in the dark, though he could not see them yet, riders had crested the eastern ridge 2 valleys over, and turned their horses down toward the pinewood. For the first days, she barely let him out of her sight, and not from any softness. She was waiting for the catch. Every kindness he did, she filed away as a debt he would one day call in, and she meant to be ready when he did. He changed the dressing each morning, and each morning she braced for his hands to wander where they should not, and each morning they did the work and withdrew. He cooked the plainest food she had ever tasted, barley and onions and goat's milk, once an egg he clearly could not spare, and each time he set the larger portion in front of her and kept the smaller for himself. When she pointed out, blunt as a hammer, that among her people giving the guest the greater share was a shameful confession of poverty, he only shrugged and said she was twice his size and had more of herself to feed. She did not know whether to be insulted or to laugh. To her own surprise, she was closer to laughing. He slept on the stone floor and would not be argued off it. This confused her more than anything else he did. Among her people, the strong took the warm place and the weak the cold, honestly and without cruelty, and a man who reversed that arrangement without explaining himself struck her first as weak. Then slowly, as something she had no word for, she began to watch him differently. She noticed that his hands, poor as he was, were skilled hands. He mended a cracked yoke in an afternoon and made it stronger than new. He knew which weeds by his door stopped bleeding and which brought down a fever. He sang under his breath while he worked, without seeming to know he was doing it. And he never once looked at her the way the humans in the past had looked at her, with fear wearing the mask of hatred. He looked at her the way he looked at the weather and the cattle and the fire, as one more thing that was simply there and had its own moods. The strangeness ran both directions, and some of it made them laugh before it made them anything else. On the third evening, she watched him step around her for the 10th time that day. Careful, quiet, always leaving a polite arm's length of air between them. And she finally set down her bowl and asked him outright what he wanted from her. Not in anger, in genuine confusion. Among her people, she said, a host and a guest who shared a fire this many days would have spoken their intentions plainly long ago, one way or the other, because to leave a thing unsaid was to leave a thing dishonest. His endless soft circling, all these little courtesies with nothing named beneath them, struck her as a kind of hiding. She asked him, blunt as a dropped stone, whether he was gentle because he was kind, or gentle because he was afraid of her. Peter went red to the ears and nearly choked on his barley. When he had recovered himself, he tried to explain the human way of things, that among his people you did not name a thing straight out, that you circled it and let it grow, that a man showed his heart in small acts and waited to be sure before he ever put words to it, and that this was not hiding, but respect. She found this genuinely ridiculous. She told him so. She said a whole people who could not say a plain thing to one another's faces was a wonder the spirits had allowed to survive at all, and that it was no marvel humans died so young if they spent half their short lives working up the nerve to speak. He laughed. And she laughed, and something in the argument had brought them a step closer, even as it showed them how far apart their worlds stood. From then on she said the blunt thing and watched him fluster, and he said the gentle thing and watched her roll her eyes, and both of them, without admitting it, began to look forward to the game. On the fourth day, the catch seemed at last to arrive, though not in the shape she expected. A cart came grinding up the valley road, and Peter moved faster than she had yet seen him move. He bundled her out to the barn, pushed her down behind the stacked hay, and hissed at her to stay low and stay quiet. No one for 100 miles, he said, would understand an orc in a human's home, and most would understand a torch. She crouched in the dark beside the old grey horse, one hand near where her weapon should have been, and was not, and listened. The trader's name was Halden, and Halden loved to talk. She heard him haggle over hides. She heard him ask, in the too warm voice men use for cruelty, whether Marsh was still up here alone, talking to his goats. Still moaning over a wife 3 years cold, Halden said, and a little girl he couldn't keep breathing. He asked whether it wasn't past time the broken widower came down and rejoined the living, or else did the decent thing and stopped haunting good grazing land that a healthy man could put to use. Peter answered him without heat, the way a man answers weather. He counted out the hides. He took his salt. He said nothing about the graves and nothing about the girl. And when the cart creaked away down the valley, the quiet came back and settled. He came to the barn to fetch her, and she was looking at him differently. And he knew why, and neither of them spoke of it. But she had learned, without his telling her, the exact shape of the grief he carried. And she found, crouched there in the straw, with the truth of him laid bare by a gossip's tongue, that it made her trust him more rather than less. A man hollowed out that deep had no room left in him for schemes. The softening came 2 days later, and it came, of all things, from a bird. A jay dropped out of the pine and stole a strip of drying meat right off the sill in front of him. Peter swore and lunged and cracked his head on the low beam and sat down hard in the doorway with his hand pressed to his skull. And Yorena, heir to more than he could dream, laughed. It burst out of her before she could stop it, rough and loud and astonished, a sound she had not made in years. She clapped a hand over her own mouth as if she had done something forbidden. He looked up at her from the floor, rubbing his head, grinning, and the thing in the room changed. And they both felt it change. After the jay, the days between them grew warmer. Though the seasons stayed cold, against all her training she began to teach him. She gave him orc words in trade for human ones. She taught him Kruth, which meant honor, and also the debt that honor lays upon you. She taught him Va, which meant clan and hearth and belonging all at once. She taught him Soren, the strength that keeps a body standing after all other strength is gone. He gave back smaller, gentler words, neighbor, mercy, and the word for the warm middle of a house which in his tongue was hearth, and which she made him say 4 times because she liked its shape in his mouth. They mangled each other's sounds without mercy. Her throat could not soften enough for his vowels, and his could not roughen enough for hers, and they laughed at the wreckage they made of each other's languages. The laughing became its own tongue, one they both spoke fluently before either of them noticed. He told her a little about the valley, the seasons, the way the river froze some winters and killed the ones too weak to bear it. She told him a little about the steppe, the grass that ran to the edge of the sky, the felt tents that could be struck in an hour, the way a whole clan would sing one low note together before a storm broke. She did not tell him who she had been in it. He did not ask. One evening she asked him how his people married, and she asked it the way she asked everything, as a plain question expecting a plain answer. He told her awkwardly about the human way, the slow letters, the small gifts left and never spoken of, the asking of a father's leave, the chaperones, the poems a man might labor over for a week and never find the courage to hand across. She listened with growing disbelief, and when he finished, she told him how her own people did it, which was the opposite in every part. "Among the orcs," she said, "a suitor did not hide and hint. A suitor declared themselves before the clan, and offered a thing of weight, a hunt brought down, a wound taken in another's place, a plain-spoken oath, and the one courted answered before witnesses, yes or no, with no soft words to soften either. There was no shame in wanting," she said. "The shame lay only in wanting quietly and letting the other guess." He said that sounded terrifying. She said his way sounded like a slow way to die of things left unsaid. And then, because the fire was low and the hour was late, and something in the argument had turned gentler than either intended, she looked at him a moment longer than the argument called for, and looked away first, which she had never done. He noticed. He did not say he noticed being human, but he lay awake that night turning it over, the way his people did, and could not decide whether he was glad or sorry that he had not been raised to speak plainly. The wound tried to undo them once. A wolf came down out of the pine wood in the deep cold before dawn, drawn by the thin cattle, and it was Yorena who woke to it first. She was out the door and across the frozen yard before Peter had fought his way clear of sleep. She met the wolf at the corral with her bare hands and a broken fence rail, and she drove it back snarling into the trees, and she won. But she opened the leg, doing it badly, and when Peter reached her, she was standing over a spray of black blood in the starlight, swaying, her pride refusing to let her fall. He got her inside. He got the bleeding stopped, his hands quick and steady on a wound he now knew as well as his own skin. Then he went to the shelf and took down the small, stoppered jar of poppy and willow that he had been hoarding since autumn. It was the whole of his winter medicine, the one thing standing between him and a bad month if the cold sickness came, as it came most years to a man who lived thin and worked wet. He used all of it on her. He did not weigh it out, did not hesitate, did not glance back at the empty jar. Later, when she understood what he had spent, she asked him why. He said only that she had torn the leg guarding his cattle, and that a man does not let someone bleed for his sake, and then measure out the cure by the spoonful. She had no answer for that. In all her life, no one had ever failed to measure. The medicine dulled the pain, but it could not reach the thing that woke her that night. Peter came out of sleep to the sound of her voice again, the way he had the first night, but this time it was not fever talking. She was fighting something in her sleep, her huge frame rigid on the straw, her breath coming in short, hard pulls, and the words that broke out of her were pleading ones, which he had never once heard her use awake. She said a name. She said, "I did nothing wrong." She said, "Do not send me out there." And then she came awake all at once with a strangled sound, half sitting up, one fist raised as if to strike whatever had been standing over her in the dark. There was nothing over her but the low red glow of the banked fire, and a poor human sitting very still on the stone floor, careful not to reach for her until she knew where she was. She was ashamed. He could see it even in that light, the way she turned her face from him and made her breathing slow by force. He did not tell her it was all right, because they both knew it was not, and she would have hated a comforting lie more than the dream itself. He got up quietly and put a little wood on the fire and set water to warm, and he made her the same pain tea he had made her the first days. And he pressed the warm cup into her hands and sat back down and said nothing at all. After a while she spoke into the dark, unasked. She said that in her life she had been sent away from every warm place she had ever stood in, and that in the dream it happened again and again. A great tent, a sign, a walking out into snow, and hands turning her toward the cold. She did not say whose tent or whose signing or whose hands, but she let him hear the fear under the pride, the fear of a person who has learned that no belonging is safe and no fire is truly hers to keep. Peter listened and did not try to fix it, and when she finally slept again, it was with her back against the wall nearest the hearth, closer to him than she had let herself lie before. He stayed awake and kept the fire fed until dawn, so that whatever her sleep held, the room around it would at least be warm. That night, by the low light of the dying fire, she asked him why he lived alone at the edge of the world, and he told her. Not carefully this time, because she already knew the shape of it, and there was no shielding left to do. He told her about Mara, whose laugh you could hear clear across a market. He told her about his daughter, who had called him by a word that was not quite papa, and was better than any word he had heard since. He told her about the fever that came the winter when the river froze, and the 4 nights he held the child and wrung cool water over her, and the 5th night when the small breathing stopped in his arms in the middle of a promise that she would be well. He told her about the 2 graves down the road, and the 6 years of quiet he had mistaken for peace. Yorena did not try to mend it or hush it. When he finished, she said in her formal way that a grief carried alone for 6 winters was a heavy thing, and that he carried it well. It was the first time in 6 years anyone had told him he carried it well, instead of telling him to set it down. He had to go outside a while after that. She gave him something back that same night, though only a piece of it. She said she had been promised once in a marriage that was not truly a marriage, but a treaty between great houses, and that the treaty had broken, and that when it broke her own, people had turned their faces from her and walked her out to the mountains and left her there. She did not say which house. She did not say she was its heir. She did not say the word that had done it, but she let him see that she too had been measured and found wanting, and set outside the fire to freeze. Peter, who knew exactly what that was, reached across the space between them without deciding to, and closed his rough hand around her huge one, and neither of them moved it for a long time. The days that followed were the closest thing to happiness either of them had known in years. Though neither would have risked the word aloud, her leg mended faster than a human's would. Once she could stand, she could not bear to watch a smaller man labor while she sat idle, so she took the heavy work of the ranch by force of will. She hauled water 2 pails at a time where he managed one. She held the leaning barn wall straight with one arm while he drove the braces home. She learned the cattle by their tempers and named the worst-mannered goat after a rival she would not explain, and Peter laughed until he had to sit down in the dirt. Working beside her, he stopped seeing the size of her and started seeing only her. The quick mind behind the yellow eyes, the dry humor she doled out like a miser guarding coin, the care she took with the newborn calf, though her hands could have crushed it. The first touch that meant something came on a bright, hard-frosted morning at the woodpile. He slipped on a frost-slick round and went down, and she caught him, one broad hand flat against his chest, holding him upright without effort. For a moment, neither of them stepped back. He felt the warmth of her palm through his shirt, and the strength held so carefully still beneath it. She felt his heart going quickly under her hand, and felt how badly she did not want to take the hand away. She took it away. They went back to the wood as though nothing had happened. Nothing had. But something had, and it lived in the space between them for the rest of that day and did not leave. That evening she fell asleep against his shoulder, worn out from the wood and the mending leg, and slid slowly sideways until her cheek rested against him. Peter sat rigid and awake for 2 hours, his arm going numb, not daring to move for fear of waking her, more at peace than he could remember being since the graves. She woke in the grey before dawn, with her face against a poor human's thin shoulder, and thought with something close to fear that she had commanded warriors and stood in golden tents and never once felt as safe as she felt here. Neither of them said any of it aloud. For both of them it was the first quiet thing they had ever wished to keep. 3 weeks passed like that, one small day at a time, until the morning the riders came. Peter had gone down to the village that morning for salt and thread, and so it was Yorena alone at the ranch when the old grey horse threw up its head in the corral and stared east, ears pricked. She had been hanging wash. She went still, 6 riders on the valley road, big grey-green shapes on horses bred to carry weight, moving with the unhurried certainty of people who have searched a long time and know they are close. She knew them before she could see their faces. She knew the set of the lead rider's shoulders. And when he drew up before the cottage and swung down and went to one knee in the mud with his fist pressed to his chest, calling her by a name she had buried at the mountain passes, heir of the Vurn, the whole borrowed piece of 3 weeks cracked straight down the middle. His name was Brack. He had been her father's shield captain since before she could walk, and he wept openly to find her alive. He spoke fast in their own tongue. Her father, the great chieftain Kargan, was dying. The clan was splitting like green wood under a wedge, and the whispers that had ruined her, the barren heir, the failed womb, the bride not worth a treaty, Brack spoke of them the way a man speaks of a wound gone bad. There were those among the loyal, he said, who had come to believe the rumors had not been found, but made. Set loose on purpose, by a hand inside the clan that wanted her gone, so that a leaderless throne might fall to someone standing close beside it. Yorena said one word, and it was the word Peter had heard her murmur in the fever. Thanos, she, was still saying it when Peter came back over the rise with his salt and his thread and stopped dead in his own yard. He saw the captain kneeling. He heard the name they gave her, and it came together all at once the way a locked thing springs open. The fine silk beneath the furs, the iron ring in her hair, the ceremonial band across her shoulder. The courtly speech, the sense that rooms would have gone silent when she walked into them. Not a lost traveler, not a warrior down on her luck, the daughter of the greatest chieftain past the mountains, heir to 11,000 spears, who had eaten his barley and split his firewood and slept in his one poor bed, and let him go on believing she was no one. He did not shout. That was not in him, but something in his chest went cold and hard. And when the riders had withdrawn to make their camp, and it was only the two of them in the failing light, he asked her how long she had meant to let him play the fool. He asked whether it had been a game to her, the little poor man and his barley and his floor. He asked why, in 3 weeks and 1,000 shared words, she had not trusted him with one true thing. Yorena, who had faced champions without flinching, could not look at him. She told him the rest of it then in a low rush. The treaty with Morith meant to seal a peace her father wanted badly. The whispers that began in the year of waiting, that she was barren, that she had lain with a man before and never caught, that the healers had looked at her and shaken their heads. Her father signed the lie with his own hand and never once met her eyes. The 6 silent guards at the mountain pass, and the cold word she was never again to speak the name of her house. She had not lied to wound him, she said. She had lied because she had spent her whole life being a title and never a person. For 3 weeks at his fire, she had, for the first time she could remember, been only herself. And she had not been able to bear giving that up one single hour before she had to. He heard her. He did not answer. He was still holding the cold, foolish hurt of it. And under the hurt something worse. The certainty that she belonged to gold tents and 11,000 spears, and he belonged to a valley nobody wanted, and that whatever these weeks had been, they were over now. He never got to say it. In the dark beyond the window, a horse screamed. They came out into a camp already breaking apart, torches moving in the tree line. Not the Vurn, others. Riders whose lacquered shoulder plates bore a mark Yorena knew, the same mark she had last seen on the men who escorted her into exile. Thanos' men. Somehow they had learned the heir was found. They meant her never to reach home. Steel was already ringing. Brack went down and dragged himself up again, bleeding from the scalp. The attackers cared nothing for a human's cottage except as fuel, and one of them put a torch to the woodpile, and the rest came on across the yard. There was no time left for the hurt. Yorena snatched up the splitting axe from beside the door, the humble tool she had shown off with a week before, and put herself between the blades and Peter without a thought. Peter had no place in a fight between orc factions, and he knew it, and he did not run. What he had was his own land in the dark, which he knew better than any of them. He turned and sprinted for the back of the corral, and 2 riders spurred after the small fleeing shape, and they rode straight into the low, mean wire he had pegged tight that first wet night. The horses went down hard and loud in the black, and the men went down with them. And Peter was on them with a fence rail before they could find their feet. He came back around the barn, in time to see a rider bearing down on Yorena's blind side. He shouted and threw himself into her, and a blade meant for her meat opened his shoulder instead as he shoved her clear. She spun and put the man down with the flat and the edge of the axe, and then the fighting had washed past them. And it was only the two of them again, on their knees in the firelight, his blood dark on her hands. She pressed her palm hard against the wound to stop it, and her hands were shaking, which he had never seen. He looked up at the heir of the Vurn and told her the one thing the last weeks had made true without asking his leave. He did not care what she was, heir or beggar at his fence. He had lost the ability to tell her title from her, and he no longer wished to find it again. Only her. She put her forehead against his. For the first time in her armored life, she said less than she felt, because she did not trust her voice with the whole of it. She said only that she believed him, and that no one before him had ever given her cause to believe such a thing. Then Brack called her name across the burning yard, and duty called with him, and they both understood that the peace of 3 weeks was finished, and that whatever came next would not be gentle, and would not happen here. By the grey before dawn, the attackers who still lived had scattered into the pinewood, and the loyal dead were wrapped, and the horses stood saddled in the mist, breathing smoke. Brack would not wait past sunrise. Every hour on the road was an hour that Thanos used. Yorena had to ride, and ride now, back over the mountains to a dying father, and a fracturing clan, and a throne with a knife hidden behind it. Peter sat on the low corral rail, the same fence she had been dying against 3 weeks before. While the guards cinched the girths and lashed the packs, to go with her meant leaving the 2 graves down the road, the swept floor, the barn he had raised, the whole quiet life he had built out of 6 years of grief. It meant being small and strange in a world that would not want him. To stay meant keeping all of that safe, and it meant the cold place by the fire for the rest of his life, and never being seen again the way she had seen him. He had already lost everything once. He knew to the ounce what it was worth, and he knew that the fear of losing more had run his life for 6 years, and handed him nothing in return. That was as far as the thinking got, because the horses were ready, and Brack gave the word, and Yorena swung up onto the tallest of them without looking at him, because looking at him was the one thing she could not do, and still leave. She rode as far as the bend in the valley road. He was off the rail and running before he had decided to run, calling her name into the mist, and she wheeled the horse so hard it nearly unseated her. He reached her stirrup out of breath. He told her he was afraid. He told her he had no illusion that he was fit for her world, or that her world would ever want him, and that some part of him would be homesick for this poor valley until the day he died. Then he told her that he did not want her kingdom or her gold or her spears, that she could keep every one of them. He wanted her. He would rather be afraid at her side than safe and alone by a cold fire for the rest of his days. She reached down and took his face in one broad hand, careful as he had taught her to be careful, and she did not quite weep. And she told him to go and fetch his horse. The road over the mountains took 4 days, and they were 4 hard days, but they were not empty ones. Peter rode near the back with Brack, because the front of the column was for the heir and her honor guard, and because he wanted to be where the questions could be asked without a whole clan listening. He had kept something from the burning yard. In the bottom of his pack, wrapped in a strip of the same shirt he had cut for bandages, lay a lacquered shoulder plate he had pried off one of the dead attackers before they rode. It carried the mark he had seen on all of them. A hooked and horned brand burned into the lacquer, and on the first night's camp he took it out by the fire and turned it in his hands and asked Brack whose mark it was. Brack looked at it a long moment before he answered. It was Thanos's, he said. There was no mistaking it. So Peter began carefully to ask, not like a man accusing anyone? Like a man who has spent his life reading weather and cattle and wants to understand a storm before it breaks. He asked who had first spoken the word Barren over the air. Brack named 2 healers, minor men, attached loosely to the clan's outer tents. Peter asked what had become of those 2 men since. Brack's jaw tightened. They had come up in the world, he said. Within a year of the rumor, both had good horses they had not earned, and a herd between them that no healer's fee could account for, and neither would say where the fortune had come from. Everyone had noticed. No one had asked aloud, because the heir was already exiled, and the matter was already closed. And there is no profit in reopening a wound the chieftain himself has stitched shut. Peter asked where the rumor had begun, not who had believed it, but where the first breath of it had been drawn. Brack thought for a while and then said slowly that now that he set his mind to it, he could not remember it starting in the healer's tents at all, where such a thing should properly have lived. He remembered it starting in Thanos's and spreading outward from there like a stain soaking through cloth. On the 3rd day, the column passed a lonely outpost on the high shoulder of the pass. A single watch tent and a corral, and one old guard named Gren, who had kept that cold post for 20 years and forgotten nothing that ever crossed it. Brack knew him and called a halt. Peter listened while Gren talked, and Gren remembered plenty. He remembered 2 winters back, a party of Thanos's riders passing through by night, going down toward the human lands and coming back before dawn, with their horses blown and their heads down. He remembered them again in the autumn just past, and again only 3 weeks ago, hard riding, secret, not the traffic of an honest man. He had reported it each time to the tent above him, and each time nothing had come of it, because the tent above him took Thanos's silver like half the clan. Peter thanked him and said nothing more, but that night and the next, he lay awake by the low fire, ordering it in his mind the way he ordered a fence line, each post set solid before the next went in. The healers who grew rich, the rumor that began in the wrong tent, the riders who moved by night toward a human valley, the mark on the shoulder plate in his pack. He did not have a weapon that could touch a champion. He was beginning to think he had something better, if only he could set it out in the right order, in front of the right eyes, under the right law. Yorena rode ahead of them, and she was not blind. She saw the human speaking low with her shield captain night after night. She saw him turn the shoulder plate in his hands by the fire. Once she asked him what he was doing, and he told her honestly that he was trying to understand how she had come to be lying against his fence in the rain, and that when he understood it fully, he would tell her. She let it go because she trusted him, and because some part of her did not want to hope for a thing that might not come. She did not know his full mind. She only knew that the small human who owned nothing had begun, quietly, to build something in the dark, and that he built the way he did everything, without hurry and without waste. On the last night in the mountains, when the fires had burned low and the guards slept, she came and sat beside him where he lay looking up at a sky thicker with stars than any he had known in the valley. For a while neither of them spoke. Then she told him quietly what waited on the other side of the pass. People who would hate him on sight, a council that would test her and use him to do it. A rival she did not yet name, but plainly feared. A man who was clever where her father had only been proud. She said she could not promise him safety. She could not even promise him a welcome. She said that a wiser man would turn his horse around in the morning and ride back down to a quiet valley and a long life, and that she would not think less of him if he did, because she had seen at last what it was to want a person free of any debt. And she would not lay a debt on him now. Peter was quiet for a while, the human way. Then he said that he had spent 6 years being safe, and that safety had felt a great deal like being already dead and simply not yet buried. He said he was afraid of the pass, and of the council, and of the rival she would not name, and that being afraid had never yet stopped him doing a thing that needed doing. He told her he had not crossed these mountains for her kingdom, and would cross them again for nothing in it. He had crossed them because for 3 weeks in a leaking cottage he had felt, for the first time since the graves, like a man with something left to lose. and he had decided he would rather lose it fighting than never have carried it at all. She did not answer that with words. She reached over in the dark and closed her huge hand around his, the way he had closed his around hers by the fire a lifetime ago. And neither of them moved it until the sky began to grey. The encampment beneath the mountains was a city of felt and smoke. 10,000 tents spread across the grass, the chieftain's great black and iron banner rising over the heart of it. And it went silent when they rode in. Word had run ahead of them, as it always does. The heir returns and returns with a human at her side. The lanes between the tents filled as they passed. Warriors left their fires. Mothers pulled children to the front to see. Thousands of eyes tracked the small grey figure on the tall horse, and none of them were kind. A boy no higher than Peter's belt darted out and stared up at him with open horror. The way a child stares at a thing from a fireside story made suddenly real until his mother snatched him back. An old warrior turned his head and spat in the dust as the horse went by. Somewhere in the ranks a voice said the word for vermin, loud enough to be meant to carry, and a low, ugly laugh moved through the crowd behind it. Peter heard all of it, and understood none of the words and every one of the meanings. He rode into the middle of a whole people's held breath and made himself sit straight and not shrink, because he had promised her at the roadside that he would not. Beside him, Yorena did not so much as glance at the crowd. She rode with her chin up and her eyes forward, and only Peter, who knew her now, could see the muscle working in her jaw. Once when a rider spurred close to crowd his horse toward the wire of a stock pen, she moved her mount a half step without seeming to and put her own bulk between them, and the rider fell back. She did it without a word and without a look. 3 more times before they reached the chieftain's tent, and each time Peter felt the whole meaning of it. And each time he said nothing, because there was nothing in either language large enough to hold what he wanted to say. There was one face in that hostile crowd that was not like the others. An old woman stood near the front, bent and grey, wrapped in the plain robes of a healer. She was not shouting. She was not spitting. She was staring at Yorena with something that looked, on a face schooled by a long life to show nothing, very much like fear. Her lips moved, as though she meant to call out. She took 1 step forward out of the crowd, into the open lane. Then her nerve failed her, and she pressed her knuckles to her mouth and stepped back into the press of bodies, and was gone. Peter saw it. He did not know yet what he had seen, but he had spent 3 weeks learning to read a face that hid its wounds. And this one was carrying a wound it could barely stand under. He asked Brack quietly who the old healer was. Brack followed his eyes to where the woman had been. That was Ossa, he said, eldest of the clan healers and the most respected, before her health failed her. And then Brack went still, because he had said it and heard it in the same moment. Ossa was the one who had examined the heir years ago, before ever there was a treaty or a rumor. If any living soul knew whether the barrenness was true, it would be her. Peter said nothing. He only marked the old woman's fear, and folded it into the thing he was building, and waited. They took him first to a great tent that smelled of tallow and sickness. There, on a bed of furs, lay Yorena Vurn, chieftain of chieftains, 11,000 spears grown old and yellow and small in the face. Yorena went in alone. Peter waited outside, but the walls were felt and not stone, and he heard the old man's voice, thin as paper, tell her that he had done what the clan required. He heard him say that a leader cannot keep a bride the treaties have named Barren, that the whole steppe had been watching, that a chieftain who shows weakness before his rivals loses more than 1 daughter. He heard him call it duty. He heard Yorena answer, and her voice did not shake. She told her father that it had not been duty. Duty, she said, would have demanded the truth and hunted down the liar. What he had served instead was his pride. He had chosen his own face before his rivals over his own blood, and designed her out into the snow rather than be seen to have raised a flawed thing. Then the old man reached for her hand, with fingers gone to bird bone, and said her name. Her whole name, the child's name he had not used since she was small. He said that in some buried place he had always known the healers lied. He had chosen not to know it, because the knowing would have cost him his face, and that this was the worst thing a father could confess, and he was confessing it now, at the end, because there was nothing left to protect. He asked for her forgiveness. Yorena looked at the offered hand and did not take it. Neither did she take her revenge, though she had 11,000 reasons within reach, and the law would have let her use everyone. She stood a long moment over the dying man who had thrown her away. When she spoke, her voice was level and terribly gentle, which was worse for him than any rage. She told him that she believed he had always known, and that this made it not better but far worse, because a man deceived is only a fool, while a man who chooses blindness to keep his pride is something colder. She would not forgive him, she said, because forgiveness is a thing owed to the sorry, not the merely dying. And she would not curse him, because a curse would mean he still ruled some corner of her, and he ruled nothing of her now. She would outlive the lie he had let stand. She would rule better than he had ruled, and love where he had only ever counted the cost, and that would be answer enough, and the only answer he would get. Then she left the tent. Behind her, the old chieftain turned his face to the wall, and before the sun went down, he was gone. She did not weep for him. She had spent every tear she owed that man years ago at a mountain pass, with 6 silent guards at her back. The council gathered that same night in the great assembly tent, the fire pit throwing its light up onto the faces of the elders and captains, ranged in their ranks. It was there that Thanos finally showed his face. He was broad as a doorway, a champion of the clan, a head and a half taller than any man in the room. He wore his grief for the dead chieftain, and his sorrow for the broken treaty like a mourning cloak chosen with care for its cut. And he was clever. That was the danger in him, and Peter saw it at once. He was not a brute who happened to hold power. He was a politician who happened to be enormous. He rose first before Yorena could speak, and he spoke well. He mourned Kargan in a voice that shook at exactly the right moment. He praised the heir's return, called her brave, called her kinswoman, and let a single tear stand in his eye without letting it fall. Then gently, as though it grieved him more than anyone in the tent, he began to lay the knife against her. He reminded the council of the treaty that had failed, and of the shame it had brought upon a great house. He reminded them, sorrowfully, of the word the healers had spoken. He said he did not judge her for it, that no warrior could judge another for a wound of the body. But he asked, as a friend and a kinsman, whether a clan already bleeding for want of a strong hand could afford a chieftain the treaties would not trust. A chieftain who had spent her exile in a human's hovel, and who now led that human by the hand into the chieftain's own tent and called the thing love. He let the word love sit in the smoky air like something faintly diseased. The step needs strength, he said, and children and certainty, and it grieved him beyond words to be the one to say aloud what every heart in the tent already feared. Heads nodded in the ranks. He had spoken to their fear, and he had spoken to it kindly, and kindness is the sharpest blade a clever man carries. He was not alone in it either. When he had finished, a grey-bearded elder of one of the great houses rose to stand with him, a man with no love of Thanos, but a deep love of the old ways, and said gravely that the champions spoke a hard truth, and that the clan would be fools not to weigh it. The steppe had lost a chieftain, and could not now afford to lose its footing, he said, and a leader must be above doubt in a time of knives. One by one, others murmured their agreement, not because they wished the heir ill, but because they were frightened, and Thanos had given their fear a reasonable, sorrowful voice to speak with. That was the whole of his craft. He never asked anyone to hate her. He only asked them to be afraid, and then offered himself as the cure for the fear. Yorena sat through all of it with her face like carved stone, and Peter, watching from the edge of the firelight, understood that this was the real danger, worse than any blade. A brute she could have broken across her knee. This man had turned her own people's love of order into a rope and looped it gently, sorrowfully. around her throat. Then he invoked the oldest rite of the steppe and challenged for her hand. A murmur ran round the tent. By tradition, the challenge could be answered in the wrestling circle, and by tradition Peter, as the one whose bond was contested, could be made to answer it in person. Thanos turned and looked across the fire at the small human when he named it, and let a slow, sorrowful smile touch his mouth, because he thought he had found a clean way to be rid of him, one that would look to the whole clan like law and not like murder. He came to make certain of it later that night. He found Peter alone at the horse lines under the cold stars, where the human had gone to stand near the one-step creature that did not despise him. He spoke quietly, so no honor witness could hear. He told Peter that he would break his spine in the circle in front of the whole step, slowly so that it would be remembered. Yorena would watch, he said, and when it was done, she would finally understand what her softness had cost her, and understand that softness dies young among real people. He told the human he had been a fool to crawl up out of his valley, and a greater fool to imagine a fireside kindness could stand against 10,000 spears. He said Peter should have left her in the mud where she belonged, and that he, Thanos, would soon be putting her failures back in their proper place. Beneath a proper hand, he said it, and he smiled, well satisfied. And he turned his back and walked away, certain he should not have turned his back, because in his contempt he had said one word too many: proper hand. And Peter, who had spent 3 weeks learning to hear what an orc said beneath what an orc said, understood in that moment that Thanos did not merely want to win her. He wanted what came with her. He had always wanted it, and the man who wants the throne behind the woman does not simply wait for it to fall open to him. He pries it open in the dark, by any means his silver can buy. Peter stood a long time at the horse lines after Thanos had gone, and he was afraid, honestly afraid, in the way a small man is right to be afraid of a large one who has promised to break him. But under fear, the fence line was nearly finished in his mind, post by post, and he found that his hands were steady. The assembly tent was packed to its felt walls the next morning. Thanos stood in the open circle, stripped for the wrestling, oiled and easy, rolling his great shoulders while the clan watched. When the small human stepped into the ring in his patched valley coat, a low sound of contempt went round the tent, like wind through dry grass. Peter did not raise his fists. He raised his voice instead, and he spoke in their own tongue, badly accented, the words coming slow and careful, because he had to reach for each one. He said that Thanos had named a challenge of strength, but that strength was not the matter before them today. He called instead upon Kruth, upon honor, and the debt that honor lays on every soul in the tent, champion and chieftain alike. Under the law of Kruth, he said, a man may be made to answer with truth before the whole clan, and a man who cannot answer has already lost more than any wrestling circle could ever cost him. The tent went still. Thanos' easy smile did not fall, but it stopped growing. Peter asked his first question. He asked whether it was Thanos' own 2 healers who had first spoken the word Barren over the air. Thanos answered without a flicker. Healers spoke as they found, he said, spreading his hands. It was a grief to everyone, but no man could be blamed for the truth of the body. Peter asked his second question. He asked whether those same 2 healers had, within a single year of speaking that truth, come into good horses and a herd between them that no healer's fee could ever account for. And where, he asked, does a sudden fortune fall from the sky onto 2 minor men, who had only ever, as the champion said, spoken as they found? The tent was quieter now. Somewhere in the ranks, an elder leaned to another and murmured. Thanos said, still smooth, that men prosper and men fail, and that he could not be asked to account for every horse on the steppe. Peter asked his third question then, and he asked it not of Thanos, but of the tent itself. He asked them to consider one small thing. When the heir was named Barren and cast out, who in all the clan had risen the fastest in the year that followed, whose tent had grown, whose herd had swelled, whose voice in council had gained the most weight, while a chieftain's daughter walked alone into the snow. He did not say the name. He did not have to. Every eye in the tent moved of its own accord to the great oiled champion standing in the circle, and Thanos felt the weight of all those eyes land on him at once. And for the first time, his easy face showed something underneath it. The murmur in the ranks rose. Thanos' voice rose with it. He said a human's word was worth less than the dirt it stood on. He said this was a stranger's theatre, a foreigner's trick, and that he had listened to enough of it. He turned to the elders and reminded them, his voice warm and wounded, that he was a champion of the clan who had bled for them 12 times, and asked whether they would truly set the babble of a valley peasant above the honor of a man who had held the line at the river fords when half of them were boys. It was a good throw, and for a moment it landed. A few of the elders looked away, uneasy, half ashamed to be doubting a man who had bled for them. But Peter had set one last post in the fence, and he set it now, quietly, so that the whole tent had to lean in to hear it. He said he did not doubt the champion had bled at the river fords. He said a brave man and a false one could live in the same skin, and that the clan need not call Thanos a coward to call him a liar. Then he reached into his coat and brought out the lacquered shoulder plate, and held it up so the firelight caught the hooked and horned mark burned into it, and turned slowly so that every rank in the tent could see it plain. He asked why the men who had ambushed the heir at a poor human's cottage 3 weeks past, men who had ridden hard to make sure she never reached this tent alive, had worn this mark. Thanos' mark. He let the silence stretch, and then he set the plate down in the dust of the circle at Thanos' own feet, where it could not be unseen and could not be stepped over. An old woman rose from among the seated ranks. Ossa, bent and grey and long past fear, dying and knowing it. She had been dragged from her tent 2 winters ago and made to set her name to a lie, and she had swallowed the shame of it every dawn since, and she had decided she would not carry it into the ground. Her voice, when it came, filled the whole tent and stopped the champion in his tracks. She said the human spoke true. She said she had examined the heir herself, with her own hands, before ever a treaty was named or a rumor stirred, and had found her as whole and sound as any woman of the clan, with no sign of barrenness upon her, not one. She said Thanos had come to her tent by night, with silver in one hand and a threat against her grandsons in the other, and had bought from her the lie that broke a treaty and exiled a daughter and nearly killed a whole clan. She was old, she said, and she was dying, and she was done carrying his silver in her belly like a stone. For a moment, no one in the tent breathed. Then the younger of the 2 healers Peter had named came to his feet, shaking, and said that it was so, that he too had taken the silver, that he would carry the shame no further. Then Brack stood and named the nights he had seen Thanos' riders slip from the camp toward the human valley. Then the old guard, Gren, brought down from his past to bear witness, stood and named the same riders, crossing his watch by dark, 2 winters running and again 3 weeks gone. Then an elder rose and another, until the standing spread across the whole tent like wind moving through grass, until Thanos stood alone in the center of a circle of people who had all, at last, done the sum and arrived at the same black answer. He understood then that he had lost, and being what he was, he reached for the only argument he had left. He lunged for Peter across the circle, his great hand going for the human's throat, meaning to take with strength what truth had stripped from him. Brack was faster, and Brack was not alone. 3 of the honor guard hit the champion at once and bore him down into the dust beside the shoulder plate. And it took all 3 of them to hold him, and even held, he was still roaring that a human's word was nothing, that a barren exile was nothing, that he would see them all under the grass. But no one was listening to him anymore. The tent had already turned away from him, the way a clan turns away from a thing it has finished with. Peter stood in the middle of the circle, breathing hard, his accented words spent, his hands trembling now that they were allowed to. He had not thrown a single blow. He had won the way he had always won at anything, by watching and waiting, and understanding the ground he stood on better than the man who thought he owned it. The council did not send Thanos to the wrestling circle. Because there is no wound, a champion cannot take in the circle and keep his name. And they did not mean to leave him his name. They stripped him of Kruth. And any human watching who thought that a soft sentence did not understand what it meant. To lose Kruth among the Vurn is to lose everything a person is. It is to lose name, so that the clan will no longer speak yours. It is to lose rank and clan and the right to sit at any Vurn fire. No hearth of the people may take you in, no matter the cold. No hand of the people may feed you. To be found on clan lands again is to be killed on sight, not as a warrior, but as vermin, with no honor owed to the body. Thanos, who had bought a lie to send a daughter into the snow, was given the daughter's own road. The council cast him out to the same high mountain passes where Yorena had been abandoned, with the same 6 silent guards to walk him to the edge of the world, and the same cold mercy he had once arranged for her. He went out cursing, into the wind, and the felt walls closed behind him, and the steppe did not speak his name again. Then the tent turned to Yorena. The lie was dead. The liar was gone. The throne was hers to take by right and by proof. And every rule her people lived by said that now, cleared and whole and named Barren by no mouth that mattered, she must make the strong marriage the clan needed and put the human quietly aside. She rose before all of them, and she did the opposite. She thanked Ossa, and told the old healer that her courage at the end had undone the harm of her fear at the beginning, and that the clan owed her a debt it would honor. Then she turned to the ranks, and she made them hear the thing that mattered most, the thing she needed them never to mistake. She told them she was glad the truth was known, but that she wanted it understood plainly. She had not come home to be believed fertile again, as if her whole worth had ever hung between her hips like a coin on a string. She said the confession they had just heard proved a crime, and no more than that. It did not restore her value, because her value had never left her. She had been thrown into the snow the day her use was doubted, and she was finished, forever being a thing that could be weighed and measured, and then set outside the fire when the weighing came up short. Whether or not she could give the clan an heir, she said. She was owed the same dignity as any soul born under the black banner, and so was every daughter after her that some frightened man might one day find inconvenient. Then she took Peter's hand in front of 11,000 spears. She said that this man had knelt in the freezing mud for a stranger he believed was no one. He had given her the warm place and taken the cold floor and asked for nothing. He had spent his last winter medicine on her without weighing it. He had crossed the mountains into a people who hated the sight of him and had faced a champion with nothing in his hands but the truth. And he had wanted her, she said, when she was barren in every mouth on the steppe and worth nothing to any treaty, and knew it. Not her title, not her heirs, not her banner, her. She said she would take the chieftainship, and she would take it with him beside her, as an equal by her own free choosing, and that any soul who could not bear it was welcome to say so now, to her face, and answer for it under the same law that had just swallowed a champion whole. It cost her, and she had known it would. Some of the great houses cooled toward her that day, and never fully warmed again, but no one in that tent stood up to answer her. And more than a few of those who had watched a poor human undo a champion by their own oldest law understood, dimly, that they had witnessed not weakness, but a kind of strength they did not yet have a name for. That night, when the tent had emptied, and the fires burned low, and the weight of a whole day had finally lifted off her shoulders, Yorena found Peter standing alone outside, looking up at the black and iron banner she now ruled beneath. She came and stood beside him, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then she told him quietly that she was afraid, not of the great houses, and not of the ones who would never forgive her. She was afraid that she had brought him into a life that would only ever be hard for him, and that one grey morning he would wake and count what he had given up, and find that she had not been worth the trade. It was the most frightened thing he had ever heard her say, and she said it plainly in the orc way, because she had decided long ago on a mountain that she would never again hide a true thing from him. Peter took her huge hand in both of his small ones. He said that he had spent 6 years measuring a life by everything it had taken from him, and that she had taught him, without meaning to measure it by what was still in his hands instead. He said his hands were full for the first time since the graves. He said she could stop being afraid of the trade, because there had never been a trade, only a choice, and he would go on making it every morning she cared to let him. She did not answer with words. She bent and rested her forehead against the top of his head, careful as he had taught her, and they stood a long time under the banner while the camp went to sleep around them. There is a stone house now at the edge of the Vurn lands, where the steppe grass runs up to meet the foothills. It is not a tent among the tents, and it is not a valley cottage either. It is a third thing built to belong to neither place and to borrow a little from both. They did not win everything, and they never pretended they had. Some of Yorena's family still will not speak Peter's name. Some clans count her weakened for the choice she made, and there are treaties she can no longer make, and rooms that go cold instead of quiet when she enters them. Down in the human valley, the village still tells the story with a shudder, and would not have him back if he asked. Both of them gave up pieces of the lives they were born to, and both know to the ounce what those pieces were worth, and neither has ever once wished the trade undone. Peter is not poor anymore, though his tastes never learned it. He still sweeps his own floor and mends his own tools and keeps a few head of cattle behind the stone house, to the endless confusion of the clan. He learned enough of the orc tongue to hold his own, and enough of their ways to be useful in the one place no one expected. It happened first over a border dispute, in the long war tent where the captains had been shouting at one another for the better part of a day. 2 clans wanted the same stretch of grazing along a river, and every voice in the tent was busy proving which clan was stronger, and the thing was sliding toward blood the way such things do. Peter sat at the low end of the tent, where a human was permitted to sit, and he listened a long while, and then he asked one quiet question that none of them had thought to ask. He asked what each clan actually needed the land for, not who deserved it, what it was for. And it turned out one clan wanted the water and the other wanted the winter grass, and that the 2 needs did not sit on the same ground at all, and that the whole day's roaring had been over a thing that could be shared by 2 people willing to look at it plainly. The captain stared at the small human as though he had produced fire from a stone. An old war leader who had wanted to spit on him a year before grunted that the peasant had a strange kind of eye, and that strange eyes were sometimes worth keeping. After that they let him stay. Now the old warriors grumble their way to the human's fire when a hard thing needs turning over, and pretend, each time, that it was their own idea to come. He's homesick some evenings for a valley nobody wanted. He has never once wished himself back in it. Yorena is harder in council than she ever was, and softer at home than any of them would believe. And for the first time in a life spent surrounded by people, she is not carrying the whole weight of herself alone. On an evening in the first warm week of the year, he was crushing dried yarrow into paste at the table, out of old habit more than any need, when she came in from a long day of hard men and hard choices, and lowered herself onto the bench beside him. The frame groaned under her and held, the way it always did now. She set her head against his shoulder, the shoulder that had healed crooked where the blade opened it in the burning yard, the one she was always careful of, and he set down the yarrow and did not move, exactly as he had not moved a year ago in a leaking cottage. Afraid to break the thing, she said slowly, that she still remembered lying in the mud against his broken fence, certain she was worth nothing, waiting to die with her pride, the only thing left to her. She said she had told him to leave her. He said he remembered, and that he had ignored her, as he intended to go on ignoring her whenever she said foolish things. She laughed, that same rough, astonished laugh, the sound he had built a whole new life around the chance of hearing, outside, A light snow had begun to fall, the first of the year, settling soft and white over the grass that ran up from the foothills. Somewhere in the dark, behind the house, the cattle shifted and lowered. Yorena reached out one huge hand and turned the yarrow paste on the board so it would dry evenly. A small, ordinary motion she had learned from watching him 100 nights. And Peter watched her do it and felt his chest go tight with the plain wonder of a life he had never once dared to expect. He did not say it. He had learned at last that some true things could be shown instead of spoken. He only leaned a little more of his weight against her side, and she took it, the way she took everything he gave her now, without measuring. Above the door of the stone house hung two things, side by side. One was the iron ring of a great orc house, her name and her blood and everything she had been born to carry. The other was a plain splitting axe, worn smooth at the haft, the tool of a poor man's honest work, and the blade she had taken up to stand between him and the dark on the worst night either of them had known. Between the two of them stood the doorway of a home that belonged to no single people, and had made room, somehow, for both. She was a chieftain's heir the world threw away as worthless. He was a nobody the world left to grieve alone at the edge of a valley nobody wanted. Everything either of them had ever been told said it could not be done. They chose each other anyway, and kept choosing one small day at a time. And that, in the end, was the whole of it. If you had been in Peter's place, would you have followed Yorena over those mountains into a kingdom that hated the sight of you? Tell us below and subscribe to OrcBond Saga for more stories where two impossible lives refuse to let each other go.